YouTube. Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson back on my academic integrity of arts and humanities. Arts and humanities is history and politics. We're on my fourth year, but on the module DD211, understanding politics, ideas, and institutions in the modern world. I just want to let some of you know that are listening, I've written a book called The Royal Prodigious Political Cipher. It's about history, politics, all family, and some of my bibliography about my family and my legacy that I've been led to believe and follow and worship. So I've written a book about the Royal Prodigious Political Cipher. It's live on Amazon and it's live on Barnes and Noble. I want to influence youth today, young adults, young teenagers, mature teenagers, like young adults, mature adults, OAPs, especially OAPs. Some OAPs think, they end their tether of their life, so why bother? But it's always good to keep your mind focused. Anyway, so we're going to reference our reading so we know we're on the same page. So the Open University Walton Hall, Milton Keynes, the first published in 2015, second edition 2022. Chapter 13, How the UK and US Political Systems Differ. Authoritative and scholarly works written as attempts by scholars to semi-codify the constitution and define its rules, such as 𝕂𝕠𝕗𝕚𝕁𝕚𝕁 Parliamentary Practice, first published in 1844, and now in the 24th edition, compromising 45 chapters. Walter Bagot's The English Constitution, 1867. And the most famous of all, Albert Dicey's Introduction to the Study of Law of the Constitution, 1885. Constitution is your local borough, just in case you didn't know, your local county, or local state if you're in America. These four sources of constitutional law in the UK mean that the UK Constitution is to be found on the various shelves of an academic library, not hung on the wall of a national museum. UK constitutional practice is a product of the historical experience with laws, customs and conventions being added to and subtracted from over time as circumstances dictate. This means that the UK Constitution is flexible rather than fixed. On this figure 4, the British Library is where one would have to go in search of the woefully uncodified UK Constitution. Of these four sources, the most important by far is statute law, which is law that has been passed by Parliament as enforced by the courts. Statute law remains in force until it is changed and thereby repealed by the same or the successor Parliament. Now statute law supersedes all other considerations. Because the sovereignty of Parliament is at the heart of UK constitutional practice, Parliament can make and unmake any constitutional law it wishes. Not act it, passes can unconstitutional. No person or body is recognised by the law of England as having a right to override or set aside the legislation of Parliament. Dicey, 1885, page 40. Government in the UK is predicted upon the rule of law, and Parliament has unfettered right to make the law. There is no higher national authority than Parliament, so no other institution may regulate in its actions except electors, who can retrospectively judge its decisions and alter its political composition at a subsequent election. Between 1973 and 2020, however, when the UK was a member of the European Union, EU, Parliament voluntarily qualified this authority in regard to policies that fell under the responsibility of the EU. Here it was accepted that when there was a conflict between the two, EU law took precedence over domestic law. This was a consequence of the EU membership freely entered by the UK and the means by which European integration was enacted. However, in regard to the EU, UK Parliament had pulled, but not necessarily surrendered, its sovereignty. The UK was constitutionally free to leave the EU should it wish, and it did not so following the EU referendum on June 2016, in which most people voted to discontinue membership. Many reasons lay behind the decision of the British people to leave the EU, one of which was to decide to take back control by having UK, not the EU, take decisions relating to trade, competition policy and European migration. By contrast, the US Civil War, 1861-65, established the firm precedent that no state or collection of states may leave the United States. Also, note that any of the four parts of the UK can decide to leave it. In the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, Scotland decided to remain within the UK. How is the constitution changed in the UK? The UK constitution is easily changed by a parliamentary majority, which we have now as Brexit, if anyone didn't know. We've got more independent away from the EU, most usually in response to urgent public demands or perceived national need. That was my little input, by the way, off the top of my head, because that's what knowledge brings to the table. For instance, the constitution was incrementally altered between 1832 and 1970 to gradually extend the electoral franchise from the House of Commons to all UK citizens at the age of 18, irrespective of class or gender. Parliament also incrementally whittled the power of the monarch down to nothing, and it called into existence of a Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly and Northern Ireland Assembly. The constitution has been altered organically because, being flexible, it is easily amendable. Constitutional reform is ultimately facilitated by majority politics. The will of majority in Parliament, whatever checks and balances might be brought to bear upon them, even if it is sometimes prompted or motivated by other factors, because subject to the ultimate will of the electors expressed at a general election. Parliament regulates itself. The courts can only hold the government accountable to Parliament's own laws. Therefore, no procedure to render a parliamentary act unconstitutional. By their very nature, all parliamentary acts are constitutional. Courts can only interpret the intention of the statute law passed by Parliament when its meaning is unclear or contradictory. However, courts can use one statute passed by Parliament against another statute, being charged with enforcing the will of Parliament. Means that the UK courts can interpret the meaning of statute where it is unclear. And should statutes be contradictory, the courts can prioritise one statute over another. Should the courts so intervene, they could thus exercise some of the political influence beyond their traditional and established role in the UK's parliamentary democracy. This has recently been evidenced in the preparedness of the courts to use the Human Rights Act 1998 as a standard to which all other statute law has to comply. But if this is unusual, it falls to Parliament to enact new statute law preventing the court from so acting, perhaps by reappealing and amending the Human Rights Act. The UK's flexible, easily changeable constitution lies at the heart of UK's majority political system. It provides governments with the power to take authoritative decisions, subject to the support of Parliament, which itself reflects the support of the people expressed at a general election. Within Parliament, all power lies, but Parliament can, for whatever reason, delegate powers to other bodies such as the EU, the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly and the Northern Ireland Assembly, thus can changes to the UK's unity. Union state be enacted by Parliament, unencumbered by a fixed, inflexible constitution that describes what it can and cannot do. US Constitution. The US Constitution, unlike the UK one, is a product of a Big Bang moment. On occasion when, having cast aside the past political leaders, had therefore to devise a new constitution from scratch, it was designed by one group of individuals, meeting in one place at one time. Having cast aside the previous constitutional order by securing independence from Great Britain, the founders of the US had to construct a new constitution to bring the 13 newly independent states together in some form of collective union, within which each would be willingly bound. The founding fathers were the farmers of the US Constitution, representing each of the 13 states. They assembled in Philadelphia in 1787 to produce a constitution written down in a single document, which was subsequently ratified by all of the states in the form of the Constitution of the newly formed United States of America. The original of this document, signed by each of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, may be viewed in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. There are thus only two sources of the US Constitution: the original written codified Constitution signed in 1787, ratified by all 13 states by 1790, and subsequently formally amended 27 times. The opinions of successive Supreme Courts, which have reviewed the meaning of the Constitution and determined which action to permit. The purpose of the US Constitution is to restrict government in order to expand liberty. It seeks to reconcile governmental authority with individual rights. Born of a fear of what governmental power might be exerted, the Constitution deliberately frustrates the use of such power by enshrining individual rights and preventing governmental activity from interfering with, or otherwise restricting such rights. How is the Constitution changed in the US? Neither the US executive nor the legislature can alter its own fixed constitution nor change. Thank you, my dear. Political arrangements set out in that constitution. Constitutional amendments can only be proposed by 66% supermajority of both House of Congress, not by a president, but such amendments can only be ratified if they gain the support of the supermajority of 75% of the 50 states of the Union. In 1791, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights, were passed. These set out explicit freedoms to be enjoyed by all citizens of the US, such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, a free press, and free assembly, the right to keep and bear arms, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, and guarantee of a fair public trial before the jury of one of peers. Such amendments were intended to signify restrict the powers of both the state and federal governments by legally empowered citizens with rights that cannot be easily be abridged, other than by similar constitutional amendment. The Constitution is thus placed above politics, even if it remains highly political. It falls under the US system, to the courts to enforce the rules set out in the Constitution and to uphold the rights it grants citizens. The custodian of the US Constitution is Supreme Court. It is comprised of 9 justices, each of whom, once nominated by the President and endorsed by the Senate, serves for life or until they choose to vacate their position. Justice cannot be removed from the court, save should they commit an impeachable offence. The Supreme Court is a constitutional court. It has power to enforce the Constitution and to interpret its intention. I can strike down decisions of the President and Congress if it deems them unconstitutional. For instance, the Second Amendment to the US Constitution asserts that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This means that the Supreme Court will not permit the President and Congress, nor any state, to completely ban the ownership of firearms in the UK. By sharp contrast, there is no such judicial review because there is no higher constitutional standard by which Parliament is judged. What are the political impacts of the US and the UK political systems? One key principle of the US political culture is belief that a government which is big enough to give you what you want is big enough to take away what you have. This view, attributed to the second US president, I'm nearly finished reading, I've got about another 5 minutes. Thomas Jefferson was popularized by the 38th president, Gerald Ford. It lies at the heart of the US belief that the government has to be limited and the rights of citizens extended. This culture is present within the US political system, where political authority is controlled by restraint by its being fragmented. The use of state power is frustrated in 2 years. First, by it being separated amongst different institutions at both the centre, the federal government, and the locality, the 50 states, and separated between the centre and the localities. Second, by providing legally enforceable rights the courts have been to uphold and which government cannot abridge. The US system of government, being separated into competing institutions, is to replete with many veto players and many veto points. The structure enables government to check and balance itself. Power within the federal government is divided between the President and Congress. The President was given legislative power in order to act and check upon the legislature, and Congress was given executive power in order to act and check upon the actions of the executive. The legislative power was further checked by a division of Congress into two independent chambers with legislation having to pass both House of Representatives and the Senate, and by the President being able to veto such legislation, which can be overridden by a two-thirds vote of Congress. The division of legislative and executive power between the independent branches of government profoundly affects the way the political system operates, with President and Congress able to veto the other. Both chambers of Congress able to veto each other. Cooperation and compromise is essential if legislation is to be enacted and administered. Without cooperation, the potential for legislative and executive action is considerably reduced. Majoritarianism is therefore not possible. It is tempered by the need to secure agreement, sometimes by supermajority, across different and independent branches of government, of course. Should President and Congress reach agreement to enact law, then it eventually falls to the Supreme Court to determine if that law contradicts the enforceable rights the Constitution provides to US citizens. By contrast, the UK executive is empowered as a powerful government, even if it takes the unusual form of two-party coalition, as was the case between 2010 and 2015. This executive, armed with a Commons majority, is therefore able to alter the Constitution as it chooses and in ways electors tolerate, but only with parliamentary approval. The party Commons majority, which emerges from the legislative majority. In the British parliamentary system, and which prioritise supplying and supporting its government, grant the government control over legislative timetable of 4 more minutes. The rights citizens pose in the UK are those granted them by the state. This reflects the UK's historical development in which people living in England, Wales, Scotland and, for a time, Ireland, now Northern Ireland, were subjects of the Crown. All owed allegiance and loyalty to the monarchical state, and their reward was to be given rights and favours by the monarchical state in return. Goldsworthy, 1999, in the present day, civil, political and social rights are conferred upon the people by Parliament, in theory because Parliament confers such rights. Parliament can remove such rights. There is no higher authority than can prevent Parliament from acting. In practice, however, there are several factors that constrain Parliament's theoretical power to act. Some statutory law passed by Parliament has become so entrenched in the country's DNA that Parliament, even if it wished to, would not be able to revoke it. Statutes providing from liberal freedoms, such as the right to vote in elections, have essentially the status of super statute. It is impossible to imagine that a future Parliament would rescind the rights provided by the earlier Parliament, for instance. The long and arduous road to saw Parliament incrementally extend the franchise from some 2% of men in 1832 to all men and women from the age of 18 in 1970 had been one-way street. In theory, Parliament could, say, take away from women the right to vote, but in practice it would not do so for political reasons. Statutes, such as those providing the right to vote, have the character of the constitutional Rubicon. Once crossed, they are irreversible, and no Parliament would dream of interfering with them. This is because Parliament is theoretically free to act, as always to practically consider and likely reaction from citizens. It has to anticipate such reactions and act accordingly. This is especially so because members of the dominant chamber, the Commons, have to seek re-election, and any government is keen to retain or increase its majority. In the US, the principle of the separation of powers presumes liberty. It is best protected where the different sets of people are responsible for rule-making, rule application, rule adjudication. In the UK, the fusion of executive and legislature blurs the distinction, especially when Parliament is ultimately responsible for rule of adjudication. A role which falls to the judiciary in the US is if, over time, the needs modern government have seen US presidency become much more important and powerful than ever was emphasised by the founding fathers who invented the US political system. Then the powers of that presidency compared to those UK executive remain qualified by the need of presidential executive and the legislature together to engage bargains and compromises in the formation of public policy. Should such bargains and compromises breach their constitutionality, The fact of their legality will be determined by the Supreme Court, which is charged with enforcing the rules of Constitution and upholding the rights it confers upon US citizens. In the conclusion, there are three key structural features of political systems of the UK and the US which provide two principal powers of each system. UK parliamentary system, a unity union state which having presently delegated certain powers to certain parts of the union, there is less unity than it was in the past. Presidential system in the US, a strictly federal state. In the UK is a flexible, easily amendable constitution. In the US, a fixed constitution that is difficult and formally amended, then it is forced by the judiciary and has power to decide what is and what is not permissible under the constitution. In the UK, a Westminster parliamentary executive able to lead legislature, which is charged by supplying and supporting as well as checking and balancing that executive. In the US, a separated executive and legislator, each elected differently by both autonomous and the other, and both having to work together, enact legislation to check and balance the other. Principles, powers of the UK and US political system. Majority political system in the UK, and in the US, consensus political system. In the UK, centralised strong government, dispersed weaker government, where powers and authorities of the federal government are separated between President, Congress and Supreme Court. UK, a powerful executive provided, of course, as we have seen, that an executive has a reliable majority of the House of Commons, which is more supplied and supported by its parliamentary majority than it is checked and balanced by it. In the US, a federal authority which is shared between the centre and the 50 localities. US political system is predicted upon a general suspicion of strong government, a populist instinct to check political elites, and the belief of having multiple centres of power within the federal government and between the government separate states of the union. Thus, the US limited government, it makes it hard for the President of Congress to pass laws, pursue a policy agenda, and enact political change. By contrast, the UK has theoretically unlimited government. This makes it far easier than the Prime Minister Parliament to pass laws, pursue a policy agenda, and enact political change. Political actors in the US are subject to significant formal restrictions on power to act. Political actors in the UK largely face only informal restrictions, such as informal restrictions mean that, as it is subject to re-elections, the UK government has to take ahead of the public opinion. In some degree, for instance, the people of Scotland wanted a parliament, so Westminster Parliament created one. It would be unwise for any government to act in such a fashion that would cause citizens to throw it out of the office when asked to be at a subsequent election to render a judgment on its own record in office. Thus, checks and balances in the UK tend to be more informal rather than informal. They are so much more political than they are legal, but Parliament, if persuaded that a sufficient number of citizens support it, it is far freer to act than the US President and Congress. The political system in the US predicted upon the federal state and fixed, inflexible constitution which provides for a circumcised government. The UK has a strong authoritative government, empowered and reformed unity state, and a fluid, flexible constitution. The primary political impact of the UK constitution is to empower Parliament and grant authority to a government that is able to command a majority within the Parliament. The Constitution limits the power of both President and Congress. It prescribes the rights of the citizens, which no state or federal authority can abridge. The majority, such as the UK, and consensus, such as the US, democracies impact the conduct of politics in the most profound, significant ways. The very nature of UK politics is bound up in fact that the majority model, which is heavily influenced by tradition and hierarchically predicted upon a strong authoritative state, provides for the centralisation of power. The politics of the US, bound by the consensus model of checking and balancing, diluting and qualifying power. Lefort, 1992 to 1999. In the UK, this is a quid pro quo for the powers of a stable authoritative government, something provided for by the structures of an easily reworked constitution and its parliamentary system. In the US, the constitution provides for limited government, and the federal system requires the federal government to share powers and competences with the states. We're going to leave that there for my reading. Thank you ever so much for waiting.